Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Dyllon Explains Everything. My name's Dylan, and in case you couldn't tell by the title, I'm the one explaining everything, including today's episode topic, plot structures and narrative structures. To start off the episode, I figured I'd talk a little about what exactly plot structures and narrative structures are. So a plot structure and a narrative structure are different, at least for the subject of today. Plot structures are basically how you actually lay out your piece of writing or piece of work, right? So it might be like the way that the sequences and events actually happen and progress. Whereas narrative structures are how the plot changes, how the narrative changes, what exactly the climaxes are and all the key points, rather than how they're split up, which would be plot structure, at least for today. So my personal opinion on structures is that some structures get way too overused, which makes sense. They are kind of the basis for every structure, but it ends up just being boring, and a lot of movies start feeling very similar because they use the same structure, and you can predict the ending, just like a formula. So before we get into that, we're going to talk about the word of the day, which is leucocholy. Leucocholy, Leucocholy, leucocholy. Leucocholy means, according to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, a state of feeling that accompanies preoccupation with trivial and insipid diversions. So basically, you're too busy thinking about stupid things, and that state of mind is leucocholy, which is, I think, a very valuable thing to know in the age of the internet, where you can get very hung up on the little things and miss the big things in front of you because you have access to literally everything that's happening in the world. And our trivia for today is that strengths is the longest English word with only one vowel. Alright, let's get right into this. Plot types. What the frick are plot types? Well, plot types is, like I said, how you divide up your story, more or less, right? So we've got a few main, structure types here, right? So the number one, kind of most used one, and you can even combine some of these too, but the most used one is linear or progressive or chronological. They all mean relatively the same thing, which is it goes forward, right? So it's kind of the stereotypical plot structure, normally associated with exposition, conflict, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution, right? So you go forward. One thing leads to another, A, B, C. You just go in that order, right? It's just one story, one movie, one book, whatever. So most Marvel movies, popular movies, pretty much everything kind of goes by this structure, with a few exceptions. Episodic is another kind of plot structure, right? So this takes individual and loosely connected events and strings them together by a theme or character. Each one has its own little pocket plot, but overall they also have an overarching theme or a character that's kind of through everything. And they also have normally a moral center or something that connects them all, even though they are individually accessible. So generally, this still remains chronological. It doesn't have to. A lot of times people will start to experiment with not going chronologically in things like TV shows. So cartoons, sitcoms, those kinds of things use this all the time, pretty much any TV show. But a lot of TV shows have been getting more and more creative with it and how to mess with it and make you think a little more. And like I said, you can combine this with other things, right? So obviously episodic actually combines very well with linear. You go from one episode to the next to the next. This does mean it would have to be an overarching story, right? So episode A actually leads into episode B. Whereas shows like cartoons and sitcoms tend to not necessarily be that way. Sometimes they'll call back to previous episodes, but you cannot be for sure that one episode leads to another. Now the next kind of structure we're going to get into is parallel. Parallel is where things start to get a little more interesting and can kind of get complex and crazy if you really work on it. So parallel means two plots of normally linear type that seem unrelated but are usually united by a theme. They run parallel until crashing together at the climax normally. So my favorite example of this is Phineas and Ferb. I love Phineas and Ferb as a show in general, but it utilizes parallel structure very well. So basically you've got the plot of Phineas and Ferb and their inventions, right? And then you've got the plot, normally of Candace as kind of a side plot, but more importantly, Dr. Doofenshmirtz and Perry the Platypus have their own plot. And they're technically completely separate other than they're in the same city, but normally they collide and actually lead to the other one's demise or success. So this is kind of an illustrative example of parallel structure, right? Two plots, they're kind of, most of the time they're linear. You can have nonlinear, right? So you could theoretically have, for example, two sitcoms, right? Where it's not necessarily linear, like it's kind of implied that it is, but it's not necessarily chronological. And another sitcom, they kind of like collide, right? They have a crossover episode. For example, Jesse and Good Luck Charlie on Disney Channel both had an episode with the other person or the other characters. And that kind of shows like those are not technically like linear, like they are in a lot of ways, but like it's more like season to season. Episode to episode is not necessarily always linear, or at least, you know, it doesn't seem like it has to be most of the time. So that could be a good example of like a parallel that's not necessarily linear and across multiple different narrative structures. So the last plot structure I really want to discuss is flashback, which is also used in Phineas and Ferb quite a bit by Dr. Doofenshmirtz. But flashback basically means the story doesn't go chronologically. It actually moves through time, flashes back to provide context, and then come back to the present normally. So basically, you could really go as far to say, like, not necessarily even flashback, but just, like, non-chronological, or even, like, achronological, I don't know. But, basically, like, certain movies like The Prestige use this fairly well, where it doesn't necessarily go, you know, A goes to B goes to C. It'll sometimes be like B goes to C, let's go back to A to understand D better, and then we'll kind of like go between A and B, revisit that a little. Oh, that thing between B and C, now that makes a lot more sense. All right, let's go back to E real quick. And it kind of jumps around like that. And sometimes it can be very confusing if not done right, or if the audience doesn't want to understand it. But it can provide for a very complex movie and a very good structure. However, it can also just be like a very simple thing, right? So a much less complex version would be something like Megamind, where the entire story is technically a flashback. He starts the story falling and then flashes back to how he got there. And that is like basically the entire story is the flashback. So now we're going to move on to narrative structures. Narrative structures are specifying what points are important. What are the points of the story, the kind of like checkpoints throughout, right? So the most like well-known example of this is the hero's journey, but it's important to discuss other things like Freytag's pyramid. Now, Freytag's pyramid is split up into these segments. You've got the intro, rising action, climax, return or fall, and catastrophe. So the hero goes after their goal, reaches the point of no return, and faces increasing tension until a tragic end. It's honestly not very common when used in this way because of the last point, catastrophe. Normally, our stories go throughout this exact structure, but the ending is a win, right? The ending is success. This does not. This ends in catastrophe. It's often used for dramas and comedies and things like that. Nowadays, though, it's pretty irrelevant as a story structure, although I think, personally, it could be used for a lot of different things, and I really wish more people did it. Honestly, you can see a trend towards things like this with movies like Infinity War, where, spoiler alert, the ending is kind of catastrophic, right? So, a lot of narrative structures don't really use this, but it is still important, and I think it's very untapped potential. The one that we normally go to, or some variations of, is the hero's journey. I don't like the hero's journey, simply because a lot of people turn it into something more basic than what it is and overdo it, and it's not great. So it's kind of broken up into 3 parts, right? So you've got part 1, which is the ordinary world, and then the call to adventure, they refuse, and then a mentor takes them, right? So basically, think of Lord of the Rings. That's kind of the most basic example of the hero's journey. So you've got the ordinary world that they start out in, and then they're called to adventure, and at first they're like, I don't really think so, and then their mentor is like, You really should, and kind of helps them cross the threshold. And that is where we get into our second part, crossing the first threshold, right? This leads to tests, allies, enemies, and then the innermost cave, which is reaching the goal almost. You're almost there. And then the ordeal, which is the actual challenge itself, and then the reward. So this is kind of the bulk of the story. It's definitely about half, at least, or sometimes at most. The key thing is that they go through trials and tribulations, they make friends, they make enemies, and then they almost reach their goal. And then they don't necessarily, but then they do. The ordeal, the actual challenge comes in, the final boss, and they get their reward. But this isn't the end. We then get the road back, right? So after the battle tensions, you're left with a bit of uneasiness. Like, they got their reward, they won. But what about this? What about that? What happened there? And you've got the resurrection. The resurrection is the final challenge of the story. This is the actual boss battle, right? The enemy comes back and tries one last time. And then the hero wins, and you've got the return with elixir, which is another way of saying the return with the ultimate objective, the main tool that's going to help them with their life from now on. So it's been made very generic. We could do a lot of complex stuff with this, like a double climax or different things like that. But oftentimes what ends up happening is it's just a long, drawn-out story to get to one specific thing. It could be so much more. And a lot of people, like Marvel movies, for example, have been turned into this, but like really dialed down, really watered down, and just not great. You'll get the person starting off where they're comfortable, they then get called to adventure. They at first are a little hesitant, but they just do it, and then they go through like a few things, boom, 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 and then, oh, did they win? Oh, they just did they? Oh, nope, they didn't. Bad guy comes back, boom, win, over and over and over and over again. This happens, but there's so much you could do with this, but people don't really do it. So another narrative structure we have is the 3-act structure, right? So this is composed of, you guessed it, 3 acts. The first act is setup. You've got exposition, the inciting incident, and plot point 1, which is the threshold of no return, right? So this is just another way of doing the hero's journey, but very much its own thing. So exposition, the context for it, right? The inciting incident, what draws them in, and then the threshold of no return, where they're actually going into something. Act 2 is the confrontation, right? Rising action, something's happening. The midpoint, something causes a challenge, and plot point 2, where they fail, and their abilities are put into doubt. And then we get Act 3. You've got the pre-climax, the build-up to the climax where something happens. Oh man, they might be able to win this. The climax where it's at its peak and you feel anticipation of what's about to happen. Will they win? And then denouement, where they win. They're done and they're finished. It's a very similar approach to the hero's journey or triangle, but with a very slightly different approach. It has been used in many movies with slight twists, and it has good potential. But overall, a lot of times it just boils down to the hero's journey again and has the same problems. Then we've got Dan Harmon's story circle. Now, so Dan Harmon has made a few things in the past. He's a writer, producer, and an actor. He's the creator and producer of Community. He's also the creator and host of the podcast Harmontown. He's the co-creator of Rick and Morty, and several other things. He's done quite a bit with story writing, so he's a bit of a reputable source. So the way he says he structures his stories is this. You've got the zone of comfort. In our hero's journey, this would be the ordinary life. Then they want something, right? So maybe it's a call to action or inciting incident, something like that. They're then put in an unfamiliar area, right? They leave the threshold. They adapt. They have to learn how to live in this unfamiliar environment. They get what they wanted, and then there's the price, right? So they get that thing that they've been working for, but someone has to die, something has to happen. And then they return to the familiar, but they're changed. They're a different person, and they've lost something, but they've also gained something in the process. This has great potential. It's simple, but that's actually great as a foundation to grow your own narrative structure off of, to do basically whatever you want. It is once again, a slight variation of the hero's journey and has a lot of the same drawbacks, but there is still that great potential. We then get something called the Fichtean curve, I believe is how it's pronounced. This one is fairly simple and a little repetitive, but it's full of potential and tragedy and useful for complex stories. So let's see. It starts off with exposition, right? This is the context for the story. Then we get the inciting incident, right? What draws the character into the crisis? You've got 4 crises as a rising action, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 things happen. Then the climax, boom, the middle of the story, the most anticipation-filled point. And then falling action as the tension dies down, and a resolution in the falling action. So as the tension is dying down, you kind of feel relieved it's the end of the story. It is a little similar to the hero's journey or 3-act story. It's still fairly basic. You could do some cool stuff with it, but once again, it's just a very basic structure, which you can build off of just like any other structure. But in the end, it just feels like the same thing. So then we've got a thing called the Save the Cat beat sheet. Now, this is basically what... So there's the screenwriter named Blake Snyder who made a book called Save the Cat. And he basically boiled down narrative structure into 15 beats. He also had a suggested amount of pages and or scenes for each of the beats. So we're going to kind of go through what these beats are. And you can find a lot of stuff online about what exactly this is, and have outlines for it to write your own stories. So number 1, we've got the opening image. This is the first scene or page, right? And this is part of this setup, which is normally scenes or pages 1 through 10, right? So opening image is just kind of throwing your reader or watcher into the story. Setup is building up, right? You've got the theme around scene 5. This is what's happening throughout your story. What exactly are you trying to get at? The catalyst happens around scene 12. And this is what really starts your story. There's a debate in scenes 12 through 25. This is kind of like where they're deciding whether or not to go into the call to action or whatever you want to make it into. Then there's the break into 2, or the beginning journey, right? This is normally around scene 25, and this is when they really get into their journey as a character. You've got the B story or subplot around scene 30, and then the promise of the premise, right? The main chunk of the story, the meat, if you will, around scenes 30 to 55. Then the midpoint, or the plot twist. Some people don't really use this as a plot twist, but they just use it as an interesting thing to happen. It's around scene 55. Then you've got the bad guys close in, the point where the hero might not win, the point where they're being chased down by the enemies, scene 55 through 75. Then you've got all is lost around scene 75, right? The hero loses something. Oh no, they'll never recover until they do. You've also got the dark night of the soul, which is the morning, the new info revealed oftentimes through the B plot, right? This is scenes 75 to 85. So the hero lost. Oh no, this is awful. Wait, there's the secret weakness that the villain has that we're going to use to take them down. And then you've got break into 3, right? Which just means you're going into the third act. This is around scene 85. You've got the finale, a long, sometimes drawn out section of the plot where the final battle occurs, and oh my goodness, everything makes sense now, around scenes 85 to 110, and then the final image on scene 110. This is what you want your audience to feel. It really needs to be defined in that final image. This is very complex and unique kind of variation of other structures, but very specific and very good kind of cheat sheet. Provides a lot more structure, but still offers a lot of variety, and doesn't necessarily just do the same thing as the hero's journey. Finally, we're going to go with the 7-point narrative structure, right? So this has just 7 points, right? The hook pulls your audience in. Plot turn 1, this is the inciting incident. And then pinch 1, where we raise the stakes. Then you've got the midpoint, which is kind of the reaction to action. What happens when you raise the stakes? What happens? Pinch 2, all hope is lost. That's it. They lost. It's done. Until plot turn 2, the magical ex machina that comes in and saves the day. And then the resolution. Boom. what happens afterwards now. This is very similar to other methods, but definitely more of a roller coaster of a ride. But once again, still simple, and you can still build a lot off of it. So a lot of the drawbacks of these is that they don't normally portray non-main characters well. They very much focus on one character, and adapting this to multiple characters can sometimes be a challenge, right? Some of them can kind of be adapted to groups, but some of them can't. And when that happens, you kind of have to make up your own structure. Then another drawback is they don't really do well without a good guy. If there is no clear hero of your story, these structures kind of start to fall apart. They rely on something bad to happen to someone and for the audience to therefore feel like all hope is lost. But if all hope was lost from the beginning, how does that matter? Another drawback is that they don't keep suspense all the way through most of the time. They let it drop off at points, and in order to have that build up, which can be amazing, you necessarily have to have a time where there is no suspense. And sometimes that can actually cause problems. You can inject more suspense even into the non-rising action or falling action parts, but it's very tricky with these structures. And finally, these all sometimes end up being very generic and formulaic if not done right. A lot of times people take these narrative structures, they put their story into it and call it a day. The problem is these story structures were never made just to be a boom, 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 you're done. Maybe they were made to, but they shouldn't be used in that way. You should take them and say, what am I going to do different? What is this going to expand into? Is this really all there is to the narrative structure? Am I going to do multiple narrative structures? Am I going to start combining things, weaving things together, introducing subplots that have their own narrative structures? You've got to do something interesting with your plot. There are unique movies. I've mentioned one already, Prestige, right? 2 main characters. Neither of them are necessarily good guys. You could kind of argue either way. But the twists, the thinking that it makes you do, combining the flashback with various tricks to make you not necessarily understand everything, but to understand enough to follow the story. It's very well done. The other movie I'd like to point to is Knives Out, which once again has 2 main characters, even though one main character is shown a lot more and appears to be the bad guy. And this is not very well done in any of the structures, right? Normally, you're focusing on the good guy who's trying to stop a bad guy from doing something bad. But when you focus on the bad guy for a moment, it starts to make you think a lot harder about certain themes. It's a lot more deep and well thought out. So those are 2 movies that I would definitely recommend watching if you want some cool structures that go really well. With all that being said, that's kind of where I'm going to leave off with narrative structures and story structures and stuff. For the future, we will probably be doing a story next episode. If any of you are feeling inspired by this episode, please send me a story to read. I would love that. You can always email me at dillonexplainsEverything@gmail.com. And if you just provide me with what you want me to share about you, if you want to be anonymous, if not, that's okay too. Whatever you want, if you have any specifications of how you want it to be done, just send me those in the email, and I will probably read your story because I don't have a ton, and I don't want to read mine because they're pretty bad. After that, we will be talking about why Phineas and Ferb works and is amazing as a TV show, because it is. And then we'll be talking about Dyllon Explains Everything. That's right, I'll be explaining why I explain everything and where this started. Which doesn't necessarily mean just explaining where the YouTube channel started. So if you want more information on that, stick around for that episode. I upload every Saturday at noon, and be sure to listen. Thank you all for watching. Be sure to share with your friends and family and everyone that you know. And be sure to like this video if you're watching on YouTube, or if you're listening on Spotify, be sure to follow. And with all that being said, my name's Dylan, and I explain everything.